y'all ready to head off the trails? I'm the Cryptid Huntress, Jessica Jones, and I'm ready to take you guys on a mysterious journey right now. We welcome you to Off the Trails right here on the Spaced Out Radio's YouTube channel. If you guys haven't hit subscribe yet, please do. We'd appreciate the love. Shout out to Bumblefoot for that awesome intro music. I always appreciate that too. All right, you guys, please find us on social media and give us a follow. On Twitter, it's Spaced Out Radio. On Instagram, it's Spaced Out Radio Show. And on TikTok, at Spaced Out Radio. All right, you guys can find me at thecryptidhuntress.com, where I have some awesome shows every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern and Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then y'all always find me here on the weekends here at Spaced Out Radio every Saturday and Sunday night at 10 p.m. If you guys would like to follow along with everything that I'm doing on my shows, if you can't keep up with me, y'all just go to my website. That's thecryptidhuntress.com, where all my shows, all the events I'm going to be at, and I got some fun pictures and stuff on there. You guys go check that out. All my social media links are there, including my Patreon. That's the Cryptid Huntress over on Patreon, and also my shop, War Woman Goods. And thank you to everybody who has supported me and continues to support me to this day. I love each and every one of you guys. All right. So, and also, Space Out Radio has a Patreon now. It's the Space Travelers Club. So you guys be sure to go join a Patreon over there, and you get all sorts of really cool stuff. And like I said last night, I was going to find out what all's in there, and I forgot. I was busy all day, y'all, but I'll do it. I'll do it before next weekend. Okay. Y'all, I have a wonderful, fantastic guest here tonight. I have Joshua Cutchin here in the studio tonight. Don't forget that right after this show, After Hours has a fantastic program set up for us. So let's get to our guests. Joshua Cutchin is the author of 7 nonfiction books about the supernatural. He has appeared on dozens of programs, including Coast to Coast AM, and is regularly invited to speak at paranormal conferences. His latest nonfiction book is the 2-volume set, Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal. In August of 2023, he released his first novel, Them Old Ways Never Died. And he's a fellow Georgia guy. Okay, we're both here in Georgia. And I've spent some time with Joshua out in the field. He came out with my team to do a little bit of research at the Meadow Project. So please help me welcome to Spaced Out Radio, my buddy, Joshua.
Hi, it's so good to be
Hey.
here. We should have just met halfway or something. We're not too far from each other.
I mean, that's right.
Yeah.
We're super close. I forgot how close we lived to each other, actually. I knew you were around here somewhere. But yeah, that's awesome. Josh, it's so good to see you again. We met under fun circumstances, or scary to some people, but to us it's fun. We were out in the meadow at an undisclosed location with my team, and you got invited out to come out and do some research with us. Tell me how you feel about that experience you had out there.
You know, I have this saying sometimes that I feel like I'm paranormal kryptonite.
Yeah, right?
It's not that I haven't had things happen to me, but I tend to not find them when I look for them. They sort of come at me when I'm not expecting it. So my experience there was relatively quiet. I did have the interesting experience of seeing a Starlink launch, which it sort of put me in the mindset of what one would feel when they saw a UFO, if that makes any sense. It sort of got me in that right headspace. But I remember that particular evening concluded with an SD session, and that was quite moving and quite powerful. And it was just, if nothing else, like, it was just good to be there amongst like-minded folks talking about these sort of things. And I have two 4-year-old boys at home, so it was kind of nice for me to get away from that too for a little bit.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah, so it was a wonderful weekend, and I got to meet so many great people like yourself. So it was. Yeah. I can't wait to go back in the fall, hopefully, when there are fewer ticks and there's better visibility through the trees.
Oh yeah. Well, here, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I was there this weekend, actually, with my team. Not my whole team. We had like a small group of us out there. It's by no means our whole team. But I went out there. I actually took my son too for one night. He was not able to get into the meadow that night because we do not allow children. Anyone under 18 is not allowed for obvious reasons, to go out there. But hey, I actually stayed back at base camp with him that night, and we were surrounded by coyotes, and that was about the strange, the most high strangeness, let's just say, that we got were those coyotes that night. So, but the team experienced some cool stuff out at the meadow that night. So,
Yeah, and it's
yeah,
kind of nice. I often say that looking for UFOs is sky watching with a purpose, and big
yeah,
we're going out doing to these research areas at night is sort of like being in the wilderness or camping with a purpose. So when you get this sort of little consolation prizes like seeing coyotes or just seeing wildlife, it's kind of like, well, that's it's not quite as dramatic as I was hoping for, but it's still a nice experience
yeah.
nonetheless. Sure.
Hey, I know. And what I say is that, well, if we don't get any kind of activity, at least we had a fun camping trip. Okay.
Exactly.
And that's all you can ask for. And it's just an added bonus to get to see a Bigfoot or see UFOs or see light beings and the portal. We had so much stuff. I know you were probably expecting probably even more activity than what you got, but we had some cool stuff that happened.
Yeah, I have this attitude sometimes, and this might be what keeps me from experiencing stuff, but I have this attitude sometimes of the pessimist is never disappointed. so
Right.
maybe that was part of my problem, is that I was going in not expecting something, not because of, the location being hyped or anything, but rather from my own standpoint and my own rotten luck. So yeah.
Oh yeah. Here, let me try to get this up. Well, okay. Here's my thing, and this is how our team kind of operates out there. As you saw, we find a connection between all the paranormal aspects, all the phenomena that's out there. There is some sort of thread that kind of holds them and ties them all together in some way. And I think that you are on that same wavelength. Okay, according to the from your books and the interviews that I've watched that you've done. And by the way, I've really enjoyed watching your interviews. You have such a fantastic take on the paranormal, and I just resonate with it so much. I'm actually getting goosebumps right now because I think that you and I are going to have a really interesting conversation tonight about all of this. But I think that my team, we see a connection between a lot of this stuff, from the UFOs to ghosts, to Bigfoot, to portals, to just whatever high strangeness we got going on out there. And I have some personal stories of my own too, but I think that you're on that same wavelength.
Absolutely. I mean, once you sort of separate the actual phenomenon and how it's witnessed from the interpretations that we sort of overlay on it, then it sort of does become a little bit more freeing in terms of how you can interpret it. So, one of the biggest ways that I tend to part ways with a lot of the orthodox thinking around this is that I kind of jumped off the extraterrestrial hypothesis bandwagon regarding UFOs a few years ago. Obviously, I can't say that that's not what's going on, but for me, and just sort of the connections that I've tended to see over the years, it seems to point to something a little bit more metaphysical. Yeah, I've often said that there are just so many places where these phenomena overlap that if it's not all the same thing wearing different masks, then these Venn diagrams overlap significantly. So that might mean it's maybe all coming from the same place and using the same mechanisms to get into our realm, and that's why we see these similarities, or any number of other possibilities. But I do think at this point, for me, in terms of what I've seen, there are aspects of the phenomena that I would be very I would find it very difficult to say that they're not connected.
Yeah. I think they're totally connected. And something else that's connected are ley lines. And I have a friend who has been traveling around the country, around the US, plotting ley lines. And she and I become good friends. And if I ever ask her for a location, I'm like, "Hey, I'm heading up to Illinois. Can you send me a map of your ley lines just so I know, what's going on up there?" And she has no problem doing that. And I got to say, Joshua, she sent me a map of Georgia, okay, in the South, and there are ley lines going right through a lot of my research areas.
You
Does that
know,
surprise you?
it does and it doesn't, because sometimes you stumble upon these areas and you just have this feeling that's like, well, there is something going on here. There's a small community, maybe I'll tell you about it at some other date, because I don't want to sort of out where it is, but there's a small community that I stumbled upon here not far from where I live at all. And I went there and I'm like, this is like some sort of, hillbilly Sedona. It just has that sort of vibe. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. And
That sounds fun.
Yeah,
I'd,
yeah, it's
I'd
really
go there.
interesting.
Hillbilly Sedona. It sounds like
Yeah,
my
yeah.
people.
Yeah, and I know that there was at least a claim at one point by someone who owned a business there that this particular location intersected with a bunch of ley lines. So, it does make me sort of wonder, and I I think that there's a lot of interesting things to be talked about on the ley line subject. How does your
Mhm.
friend sort of determine this? Is it through dowsing or just psychic intuition or what exactly?
It's a lot of stuff. Actually, I met her at the Etowah Indian Mounds, which are not too far from where you live and not too far
Right.
from where I live.
It's one of my
And
favorite places. Yeah.
isn't it wonderful? I mean, I get out of my car there and I actually heard the word and I felt giants. Okay.
Mhm.
Giants of all things, which is not surprising. Those mounds are gigantic. I had no idea they were so big.
Well, and actually, if memory serves, back when the Etowah Mounds were called, let me get the name right. I'm cheating here, and I'm looking at my PDF. Um, at one point, back when the Mounds at Etowah were called the Gilman Mounds, I think, or Tumlin, I can't
Okay.
remember. But before they were named, before they were renamed Etowah to get them closer to their actual indigenous name, yeah, the Tumlin Mound. Um, Before they were renamed that was one of the sites where they actually supposedly found a thigh bone that suggested that the owner of the thigh
Ooh,
bone stood 14 feet tall. So the fact
what?
that you sort of, yeah, so the fact that you sort of
I
clued
didn't
in
know
on
that.
that, yeah, is pretty interesting. Yeah.
Oh, oh my gosh, I'm not shocked. Okay, so I met her there. Her name is my friend Tracy. Okay, and so I met Tracy and Norma Jean and Tanya, and Norma Jean is from North Georgia and Tanya's from Vancouver, Canada. And they had all gotten together and they were just kind of going and they were doing what we call grid work. Okay, where they're going to like
Okay.
places
Mhm.
of power, ancient sites, and doing some energy clearing and stuff like that. And they were traveling along. I guess they're kind of connecting. I think Tracy was connecting the Indian burial mounds to each other, like traveling in these lines and trying to see there's something more to these, where they're laid out and stuff like that. So that's kind of what she was doing. And she'd been to like Serpent Mound and,
Mhm.
a bunch of other mounds. I mean, even the one up in Helen, the one that's in
Yeah,
Helen that
there's
has
that
the
little
gazebo on top of it.
yeah, there's a tiny little one, like, near the Unicoi Forest. Yeah, it's got the little gazebo. I
Yes.
know exactly which one you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah. It's called
Um,
the Romeo and Juliet Mound, is what they call it.
okay, yeah.
But
Um,
it's got an Indian name too.
yeah, and I used to have instant recall for this stuff, but I've forgotten it now, but, I mean, that seems like a good strategy. I mean, if you look at sort of the old world monuments, they certainly tend to align along those ley lines, and I am of the opinion that, the indigenous people in North America built their mounds, and the indigenous people in the old world built their mounds, and the reason that these things look so similar is just because it represents some sort of technology that we all sort of came up with as a species. That really sort of allow us to access these points, sort of like outposts to the other world or launch pads into the other world. And there is some indication if you look sort of at the old world traditions, and it's spoken to a little bit in some of the new world traditions as well, that these sort of straight paths are sort of the same orientation that you would believe that spirits would travel on. There's this sort of motif that you see through really worldwide of spirits being arrested by complexity. So this is why dream catchers work, or witches bottles, or I know that in the American South, among some African American communities, and like the Gola community of South Carolina, they would put a colander out on their front doorstep, so the boo hag would have to stop and count the colander. So there's this idea that like spirits tend to be very direct in their pathways, and that seems to me to speak to maybe the fact that there's some sort of energy that is traveling between these sacred sites, regardless of where they were built in the old world or the new world. Yeah, so that seems like
Wow.
as good a technique for any as figuring out ley lines in the U.S. Yeah.
Yeah. That just brought up something. And by the way, my lights just flickered. That was weird. Okay.
Oh,
What was
oh.
that about? Okay.
Maybe I'm not paranormal kryptonite. We'll see. Yeah.
What is going on, Joshua? I don't know. I'm perplexed right now. Okay. But okay, so we're talking about boo hags, and that's something that's very southern, something like southern hair. I mean, I want to say like heritage, but like a story like the boo hag. I mean, we have witches, we have boo hags, we have a lot of traditional things that we do down south. And as a matter of fact, our neighbor has blue bottles all over a tree outside their home.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of like another house. I live in a historical area of my town, and some of the houses are very historical, and they have blue paint on the ceiling on their porch outside, and they call that
Paint
paint
blue.
blue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Paint blue. Yeah.
So what is up with this blue? There's a lot of blue stuff going on out here related to the paranormal.
Yeah, you find these sort of like little architectural quirks in certain places that you go. I can't speak exactly as to why the blue thing is a thing. I'm sure I read it at some point, and I'm sure there's some theories that go back and forth. But the first time I ever heard about Haint Blue was in Charleston. When I visited there, good Lord, probably a decade and a half ago or 2 decades ago. But you will find these sort of architectural quirks, and if you know what you're looking for, it really does sort of re-enchant your different communities. I mean, one of the things that I always found interesting is there's this house near where my folks live. I'm from North Carolina, and you look at it, and there's not a right angle in the house anywhere at all, and you're like, what's going on with this house? And it wasn't until years later that I found out that there was a certain belief that was especially prominent among spiritualists that spirits would actually congregate at right angles in homes. And there's actually a house in Illinois that was built by spiritualists after tragically some of their children died, that they actually did not include any right angles, so that would somehow facilitate their deceased children coming in when they would conduct seances. It's a police station now, and supposedly it has a lot of activity that goes around inside. So yeah, just once you start seeing these things, you start looking for little architectural quirks. I saw another post on Facebook today, actually, of a church in Vermont that's round. It's a round church, and I'm like, it's probably has something to do with that same idea about right angles being conducive to spirit entrapment or something. So yeah,
Wow.
it's a cool thing. It's a rabbit hole all of its own.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I was just doing a show on Friday with my friend Eric at Paranormal Highway, and his brother. We were talking about the same thing. I'd never heard that before, about how when you sage a house, go to the corners because that's where the spirits hide.
It makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm aware that in some old world traditions where they would have like a household spirit of some sort, and these were all very much culture dependent. Brownies in Scotland, or domovoi if you were in Eurasia. Just very much culture
Yeah.
dependent. But if you were to have a household spirit, sometimes you would put its offerings, its milk or its bread or whatever for the day, in that right angled corner. So yeah, it's all just one of those things that just,
Absolutely.
that's the thing that fascinates me about a lot of these paranormal topics, is because they really do color our experience day to day more than we realize. And we're still living with a lot of these beliefs, and what people who don't believe would call superstitions, even if we don't necessarily recognize them or acknowledge them ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And speaking of mounds, I've seen a video of you. You've been to Ireland, okay, and you really look into something that I have hardly ever talked about on my show. And I'm the cryptid huntress. I should be talking about fairies and the fae, and I haven't. I barely touch on them ever because I just don't know a lot about the fae, and that's your specialty, Josh. So I would love to talk to you about the fae tonight and the wee folk,
I would,
because I don't
yeah.
get a chance to do that.
Oh,
Yeah.
I would love to. So
Okay.
yeah, if you want to, you can just sort of put yourself on mute for the next 45 minutes, and I'll go by myself.
Absolutely.
Just talk up. No,
Let's do it.
in all seriousness, for some reason, and I don't really know why, but I became really enamored very early on with Jacques Vallée's 1969 book Passport to Magonia, and in that book, Valet does a very good job, in my opinion, of showing how it looks like, and I know this is probably going to ruffle some feathers amongst people who are, hardcore extraterrestrial believers, but it does appear as if the UFO contact experience is in a lot of ways reworking a lot of these older motifs that we would have associated with fairies. Now,
Wow.
of course, in 2023, we hear fairies and we kind of laugh and like, oh, the little pixies and Tinkerbell with the wings and all that. But if you look back at these older traditions, which really are universal, I mean, I would say that every culture on every inhabited continent has some sort of belief that is at least a stand-in for the fairy folk. They weren't these benevolent little winged women that grant wishes and stuff like that. They were a race of spirits in each of these cultures, called by many different names, but they generally share the same suite of attributes, which were the ability to change shape and change size, oftentimes appearing small, oftentimes living underground, and very fond of abducting people in the populations who were considered most vulnerable, which, back then was deemed to be women and children. And you'll find these sort of beliefs everywhere. But if you look at sort of the UFO stuff, the modern UFO contact experience, as compared to specifically the Western European fairy folk encounters that you would read in something like Walter Evans Wentz's Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, it's just like a laundry list of similarities. Not just the size and the size of the heads in terms of the grays, but like you start to see these things and they get more and more specific. And there was a time when I used to say, I think that the UFO alien thing might be the same thing, but I'm not sure. But that really changed once I learned about something called the fairy blast, which was a belief in certain parts of Ireland and the British Isles that if you offended the fairies, which were famously capricious, they could either do things in your favor or do things against you. If you offended the fairies, you could get hit with a blast of wind. This is where blast, blustery, and blister, they all share the same root. The fairy blast of blustery wind would hit your skin and cause a blister, and inside the blister would be all sorts of things. You read these stories and these anecdotes where people would open up these fairy blast wounds and they'd extract a tooth or a bit of ceramic or or nails or bones and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that sounds a lot like the implant thing, doesn't it? There's even a story I found from Newfoundland where they removed a bunch of string, which kind of sounds like Morgellons, right? Which people have associated with the UFO contact experience. So that's when, for me personally, I was able to say, it looks like these modern alien abductions and these older fairy kidnappings, I think that they're describing the same thing. And people sort of misinterpret what I mean by that. I'm not saying that UFOs, or rather, I'm not saying that modern aliens are fairies, and I'm not saying that fairies were aliens. I'm saying that we're both using these culture-dependent descriptors to describe this thing that has an objective reality. But whatever we tend to call it is sort of what is best sanctioned by our culture at any given moment in time. And from there, I've written a lot about that comparison and that intersection. But yeah, it's just, we could probably go another 90 minutes just on me listing all the different similarities between these two phenomena. And so it makes me think that was really my first step in adopting that paranormal approach that you alluded to when we first started talking.
Yeah. Okay. So my team and I, and myself personally, we experience a lot of orbs out in the field, and there are all sorts of different orbs. Now, orbs are a very interesting topic because there are different types. I've seen orbs that are translucent, some that have faces in them that look human-like. There are some that are metallic. Okay. And I have a good friend who was out in the field with me this weekend who has a video of orbs that shoot down past someone's camera in their backyard and they turn into gray aliens. Okay. And
I need to see this.
Oh yeah. He needs to come on my show and release the footage is what he needs to do. But it was some footage from a friend who's since passed away, and he promised her he wouldn't release it, but I'm trying to get him to release it. He will one day, I think. I'm going to get him to release it. It's important as far as disclosure goes, especially. Now, there's so many different types of orbs. Now, some of those orbs can be explained by like gases in the ground and, moisture in the ground and things like that, but not the ones that we've experienced.
Right.
Sometimes I believe they may turn into Sasquatch, okay? Or Sasquatch turns into an orb. It's almost like a non-corporeal type of energy ball. Okay. It's just really odd. I mean, the more I'm experiencing this stuff, the less I know, obviously, because I thought I had it all figured out.
Yeah, the example that I like to use nowadays is that, like, trying to figure out what the whole of the paranormal is a bit like trying to like squeeze a watermelon seed. And as you squeeze it, it just goes pew, and just when you think you have a good grasp on it, it shoots out and flies far away.
Yeah.
I mean, the orbs are a perfect example of sort of what I'm talking about with the UFO, the alien fairy connection. Because like, what is more context dependent than an orb, right? You see one in a house and it's a ghost, and you see one in the sky and it's a UFO. You see one above an old monument in Ireland and it's a fairy, or again, this connection with Bigfoot that you alluded to as well. I'm fascinated by them. I'm actually working on a project with a friend of mine that's going to be looking into that, because you're right. Some of them I have seen people sometimes get upset about this too, but I have seen photographs of orbs that are dust, and I have seen that some that are bugs. But I also have plenty of stories, and I've seen lots of footage of things that do appear to be intelligently controlled and are not bugs or dust. You know, they reverse direction in odd ways and stuff like that. And of course, these stories about, you know, this connection between the lights and Bigfoot. You know, it's absolutely fascinating to me. I wrote about that a good deal with my co-author Timothy Renner in our books Where the Footprints End. And you know, it's interesting how I feel like I don't know, maybe you could tell me whether or not you get this sense as well, but it seems like the Bigfoot community, maybe not the cryptozoological community at large, but the
Mhm.
Bigfoot community is really starting to warm up and open up about talking about some of these ghost light experiences.
Oh my
I
God.
seem to have noticed that.
Okay, well,
Um,
that's because you're hanging out with the right crowd.
okay,
I'm just
good,
saying. I'm
good,
just saying, and, because there still is a primate in the woods camp. Okay,
right,
so there's like the two camps. There's the woo. Okay, and I'm a proud card carrying member of the woo. Okay,
yeah.
because that's what I've experienced, and that's all I know. I've experienced the woo, as they call it. I didn't even know it was the woo until I came to Space Out Radio, but I've experienced that from day one, being out in the field.
Mhm.
But there's also people that are still in the primate in the woods camp, and that's okay. They'll
Yeah.
graduate one day. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, I wound up in the woo camp because I was really resonating with skeptical arguments. Because, I mean, like, you know, I would hear things like, so first of all, ardent believer in the existence of something that we call Bigfoot. I'm not saying that. But, you know, you would hear these sort of objections raised by the skeptical community of things like, you know, well, why haven't we found a body? And yes, I can talk all day about, like, you know, porcupines stealing bones and Bigfoot burying their dead. I know all those comments, but like,
Yes.
or like, you know, the common comment of, you know, well, we don't often find bear and cougar carcasses, and I'm like, yeah, but we have it at some point, you know. So it kind of makes me wonder if there's not something, again, stranger than you know, a flesh and blood primate going on. And sort of the objection that I get from the flesh and blood hypothesis folks is that, you know, well, ghosts don't leave footprints, and ghosts don't leave behind hair, and ghosts don't leave behind blood. And I'm like, I think that if you were to read your parapsychological literature, that doesn't seem to be quite the distinction that we should be drawing. I mean, one of the first ways to ghost hunt was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to manifest. Ghosts slam
Mhm.
doors, and you know, if you look into the other side literature talking about things like apports and poltergeist phenomena, you have these objects that seemingly have a physical basis. You know, some people have collections of these apports that just seem to materialize out of nowhere. So I think that we sort of need to rethink what we're talking about when we talk about physical and non-physical, and that gets into very uncomfortable territory for some folks. But I also think there might be a way to have our cake and eat it too. What I mean by that is that if you look at something like the UFO phenomenon, you'll inevitably run into stories of screen memories, right? Where there's an owl associated with the UFOs, or there's a deer associated with the UFOs, and you know, I believe that flesh and blood owls exist, and I believe
Oh
that
yeah.
flesh and blood deer exist. So maybe there is a small population of relic hominids, and this is just another one of those masks that whatever this stranger phenomenon is sometimes appropriates whenever it makes contact with human beings. That's sort of my attempt to make everyone happy, and I realize that I won't make everyone happy, but yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I have a really interesting connection. Okay, because I know that you make a connection between UFOs, possible alien abductions, and the dead. Okay.
Yeah.
And now I have something really interesting to tell you
Okay.
tonight.
Okay.
And I've been dying to tell you this. Okay. I've been dying to tell you this. And I'm
Okay.
actually super excited that you're here tonight. Let me take this comment down. I feel like my face is covered up there. Okay. Sorry. I gotta have the full screen for this one. Okay. So when I was a kid, I used to get visited by ghosts. Okay. When I would wake up at night. And I'd have people standing around the bed and even into my early 20s. Okay. And I'm going to say 30s. Okay. Because even up until the time my brother passed away in 2006, y'all are going to know how old I am now. Okay. Unfortunately. But it was, I would have people and they looked as solid as you and I.
Mhm.
Okay. And they would talk to me and their mouths would never move. Okay. And I would always notice that they would stand there and they would be in period clothing, like Victorian era or whatever era. I don't know. But their mouths wouldn't move, but I could hear their voices. Okay. So I spent my whole life thinking I was being visited by ghosts. Well, then once I started going to the woods and doing Bigfooting, I started, I had a possible alien, a UFO experience. I had several out in the field. And the head of my team said, okay, I need you guys to start studying UFOs and alien abductions. And so I started, and I was like, wow, I came out here to do Bigfooting, not get abducted by aliens.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. But around that time, I was reading books like Communion and The Threat and all sorts of different books,
Mhm.
just to learn about alien abductions. And I started having aliens in my bedroom at night. Okay.
Yeah.
And they had the exact same mannerisms as those ghosts had had when I was a kid. Okay, so I started thinking, I'm getting goosebumps right now. I started connecting that I think those ghosts were actually ETs.
Yeah, I mean, so
Yeah.
so no, I think that's the right train of thought to be on. I tried as someone who considers himself a comparativist, I try to sort of not pass as many judgments on whether or not the ghosts were ETs or the ETs were ghosts or any of those things in between. But yes, I do think that you're absolutely right in there being something of a connection there. I mean, well, obviously I
It's
do because I
so.
wrote 2 gigantic books on it,
Right.
but yeah, it's something that once you start digging into sort of the history of the UFO phenomenon, looking back to the contactee era of the 50s and 60s, you'll start to find these allusions to there being some sort of link to the dead. The link to the dead is baked into that fairy connection that I mentioned earlier, because
Yeah.
a lot of cultures, again, especially in Western Europe, but I make an argument in Ecology of Souls Volume 1 that this was a worldwide phenomena. A lot of these cultures that thought of fairies sort of thought of them in the context of the dead. There are stories of the dead showing up next to fairies or the dead becoming fairies. So if you use that sort of transitive property, if the alien stuff and the fairy stuff is describing the same thing, and there's kind of these dead spirits creeping in on the perimeter on the periphery, then
Yeah.
is that implying that there really is this is all sort of one larger reality? And of course, you mentioned communion. There's this famous anecdote that Whitley tells time and again of his wife Anne sort of acting as a in an administrational capacity, receiving correspondence from readers and writing them back and sort of making observations. And one of the observations that she made, which she has talked about in his books time and time again, is this has something to do with what we call death, which I always think is an interesting way of putting it, what we call death, because it could be a lot of things. And I think some of the discussion now around the possibility of these beings being interdimensional might be hinting at this sort of death connection, because there are a lot of people who have near-death experiences and then see UFOs afterwards, or vice versa. They'll have a childhood experience with a UFO and then have a near-death experience. People who see UFOs grow up in haunted houses. A lot of people who have UFO sightings have poltergeist phenomena afterwards. Nobody talks about this, but it seems to be like a majority of people who have a
Me.
dramatic UFO. Yeah, yeah. So I mean,
Yeah. Me.
so what is this? Is the poltergeist thing? I know there's a conversation around it just being like latent psi, RSPK sort of firing off afterwards, but like
Yeah.
it's something that we once understood as being spirit or ghost related. So, and then of course, a lot of dead loved ones show up aboard craft in these alien abductions. I really don't know what to do with it. Like I kind of found something that works for me in Ecology of Souls, but it's just such a strange outlier, and it really does raise a lot of questions. But again, it points to the fact that these things are somehow connected, which I kind of find thrilling, because it implies that there is a layer of reality underneath what we observe that is just as real and just as important to our lives, if not more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've always seen that there is a connection between all this stuff, but like this gets way more precise and deeper into the phenomenon, all being connected, because, and it all makes sense because I have seen objects levitate right in front of my face. Okay. I've seen object with nothing there. Of course, I'm a
Mhm.
remote viewer. This is before I was a remote viewer, or and really tapped into my psychic abilities. But I mean, I've made. I'm not going to say I made things cut on like didn't have batteries in them, but I think I did. I've had toys cut on that had no batteries in them, right underneath my bed, like a Santa Claus. For instance, there was a Santa Claus toy that belonged to my great grandmother. The night that she died, this is a story I don't tell often. The night that she died, I didn't know she died. And she had given me this creepy, creepy Santa Claus that danced and it moved its hips. and it said "Merry Christmas," and all I heard from coming out from under my bed was, "Jessica, I'm gonna kill you."
Oh, geez. That's
Because that's what I thought. I couldn't, because it was very
oh,
like low, and I couldn't. And in my mind, I was like, "What is that sound?"
that'll
And
make your blood run cold. Yeah.
I started pulling things out from under my bed frantically, like, "Oh my God, what is that?" And it was that Santa Claus, and it was moving and it was talking as I pulled it
That's
out, and I said, "Merry Christmas." And I
no.
found out the next morning my great grandmother had died at the same time that doll was talking.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
you find these little synchronicities like that sort of bubbling up around contact experience. And,
yeah,
the fact that you've had electronic malfunction, I mean, that's something that you see for when people who have had near death experiences. Now, I'm not the first person to bring this up. I mean, this was explored
okay,
at length with Kenneth Ring's research in the Omega Project, comparing alien abductions to near-death experiences, and Eddie Bullard, who was a folklorist from Indiana University, compared alien abductions to sort of shamanic initiations. But I think what if Ecology of Souls does anything, it sort of puts all these different interpretations into dialogue with one another, so you can kind of come away with an idea of what happened. But it really does seem that there is something that connects all these things. And like I said, that's why I sort of started off by saying, like, once you sort of admit that maybe the extraterrestrial hypothesis isn't correct, and maybe the big monkey in the woods idea with Bigfoot isn't correct, and honestly, maybe the idea that ghosts are dead people might not be correct. Once you start to sort of look at other options, it really does allow you to draw some connections that you might not have normally drawn.
yeah. An open mind is so important when you're doing the stuff that you and I are doing. You got to keep an open mind about this stuff. I mean, there's the shadow people and
Yeah,
Hat Man, and people often ask me, since I'm a remote viewer, do you think shadow people are remote viewers? And I used to say, oh heck no, there's no way. And now I'm like, well, maybe they are. I don't know.
I
I don't
love
know
this. I
anymore.
love this idea, because
Yeah,
if you look sort of through the literature, I mean, well, not even the literature. If you just look at your folklore, I hesitate sometimes to say that something's universal, but the idea that a ball of light is the soul, like, that is a
yeah.
universal thing. And that has spawned a lot of speculation over the years that some of these UFOs that are seen in the sky that are not structured craft, but are just balls of light, might be souls. Souls of the dead, maybe, but also perhaps, souls of people who are astrally traveling or doing something like remote viewing.
Mhm.
You mentioned, shadow people perhaps being remote viewers, and as a remote viewer yourself, are you familiar with the story of Ingo Swann remote viewing the moon?
Oh, absolutely. I
Okay.
have his book,
Okay.
Penetration.
Yeah,
Yes.
that
Oh, I'm very
awkwardly
familiar.
titled book. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah,
it is actually.
there's that moment when the moon people turn around and they look at him
Oh
in
my
whatever
gosh.
state he is, right? Like, they realize that they're being observed, if we take
Yep.
Ingo's testimony at its face value. And so my
I
question
believe
is,
it.
what did the people on the moon see, right? Did they see a spinning disc? Did they see a glowing orb? Did they see a shadow person? Like, the idea that we could maybe be observing souls of some sort that are dislodged and sort of doing their own thing, and that's what we see in some cases, at least with the UFO phenomena, or with shadow people, or honestly with a lot of these different topics. It's something that I find endlessly fascinating, and it's something that's been
Yeah.
played with for a while. I think even John Keel speculated that perhaps some of these glowing orbs might be people whose souls have left their body temporarily, because I think we all do this when we sleep and stuff, so
Oh yeah.
obviously there would be a lot of them at night.
Astral traveling. Yeah. I mean, I love this conversation we're having tonight. Now, I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to these fairies real quick, because I was remembering a friend of mine sent me some pictures of some rocks. And I think this was in Central America or South America. And it was rocks. And this friend of mine said that this is pretty common down there, that they'll take these rocks. They're almost like, it's not really a geode, it's a regular rock, but they crack them open with a hammer and there's fairy bones in them. And he
Hmm.
sent me a picture, and I thought, oh, that can't be real. And he was like, no, I believe these are real. What do you think about that? Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that specifically, and my mind goes in about seven different directions. So, the first thing that I will say is that, generally speaking, when I see like a fairy mummy or body or something, I'm put in the mind of gaffs, like the Fiji
Okay.
mermaid and stuff like that. But that's not really a fair stance, because if you look back through a lot of sort of the literature, it's always emphasized, much as our discussion with Bigfoot, possibly,
Yeah.
that these things have a spiritual and a physical side. I mean, I'm talking about UFOs as being psychic objects here, but they do leave burn marks in the ground, and they do seem to have that sort of physical nature as well. So in that sense, perhaps there is something such as fairy bones. I mean, we certainly see lots of fairy artifacts from the old world in the form of like fairy chalices. One of my favorite ones is a set of little fairy shoes that are made of mouse leather, and I'm like, who's gonna skin and
Mouse
tan
leather.
mouse leather? Like, who's gonna do that,
What?
right? Yeah. So like
That sounds weird.
there does seem to be some sort of interplay between the physical and the non-physical in this sense too. And you might, if you're sort of immersed in some of the literature that I am, draw comparisons to things like saints relics or things like the phenomenon of stigmata, where people are not really suffering physical wounds, but their bodies are still manifesting physical symptoms. So it seems like there are aspects of this, let's call it the other world, that can sort of leave behind relics around which belief sort of wells up, I guess. And the other thing that your story put me in the mindset of was these old Fortean stories. They're some of my favorites of the toad in the hole. Are you familiar with these?
No.
Yeah, it used to be a very common thing, where people working in a quarry in Dartmoor or something would have like a rock, and they'd crack it open, and there would be a fish inside or a frog inside. The biggest the most famous pop culture version of this is Michigan J. Frog from the Looney Tunes films. He was discovered I believe in the cartoon, they're working on a construction site, and he's discovered in the cornerstone of the foundation. It's a variation on that entombed animals trope, and you'll find this throughout a lot of this older folklore, that people claim to crack open, rocks, quarried at extensive depths, and they'll find everything inside, from frogs to salamanders to reptiles and things like that. So it kind of sounds like the same sort of thing that we're talking about with these fairies encased in these geodes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I mean, we live in such a weird, awesome world. And I had one other thing I just wanted to like tell you about this. This is such a cool story because I've been listening to some of your interviews, and you make that connection with the UFOs, and I was kind of making the connection to orbs, being connected to death. Okay. And people who have either passed over, or at the time of death, or even at the time of an alien abduction, there are ghosts there. Okay. So like there's ghosts, there's orbs, there's all this stuff is like interconnected. And we have a lot of stories in my family that are passed down for generations of paranormal stuff that happened, including ET abductions, which my great grandmother called it angels moving her out of harm's way. Okay. When they had an abduction back in the 1980s in their car driving down the road. But back in, I think either early 1900s or the late 1800s, one of my great grandmothers was passing away in her house, and the whole family had come to gather around as she was dying. And they said that a fireball floated out of the woods, and it circled the entire house, past the windows, under the house, and inside the house, and went in every single room. And then it left, and then it went back into the woods, and it disappeared. They called it a fireball, but it was really an orb. It was like an orb or something. And it went in, and it just kind of checked everybody out, and everybody just stood there and watched it as it moved through the house.
Well, it was just ball lightning. Come on, just ball lightning.
Just ball lightning? I don't think so.
Well, that's another thing that you will find, through a lot of these different folklores. Again, it's one of those things that seems kind of universal. It's getting close to it, if it's not literally that, where these sort of light orbs are considered death omens. We were talking about ley lines in the beginning. Sometimes these light orbs would travel along these straight lines, which were sort of considered corpse roads. There would be the roads from the church to the cemetery, and the procession of lights would always occur before a death in the community. So that's just one example from parts of Western Europe. But these ideas found their ways. I mean, honestly, you'll find them in a lot of indigenous testimony from the New World. You'll find it in Australia and India and in a lot of different places. But I know that there was at least at one point a survey of people, and I believe it was one of the Midwestern states, I think it might have been Illinois, of people around the turn of the century that just collected members of this one county and all their stories that they had with these lights appearing just before or just after people's deaths, and it's an incredibly common thing. And you know, interestingly enough, if you look at sort of the UFO literature, you'll find examples of certain experiencers who have had that same sort of thing. And of course, given the framework that they're working in, they're like, oh, the you know, the beings from another planet are coming to take me away. One of the famous examples is, or a more famous example, I guess, is the son of UFO contactee Howard Minger, who had a lot of light phenomena around his bed. He tragically died at an early age from cancer, but he told his parents to not worry because they were the beings from, I believe it was Orion, that were going to come take him away. So we see the same thing, these lights around the time of death. It's just a matter of what the people who are experiencing it have a framework for in terms of what they call it. Because if you look back to, you know, that example that I provided from Western Europe about these lights traversing along these corpse roads, you know, they were called, you know, they were called corpse candles because they were somehow viewed as this harbinger of spirits carrying candles in this premonition of a funeral procession, not possession, procession. Yeah.
Wow.
That's amazing. I mean, it's so consistent though. I mean, that seems to be a thing that a lot of people have shared over the years.
Wow. Well, I had never heard that story, but I mean, anyone else tell a story like that. But then when I think I did talk about that one time on one of my shows, and I had people that said, "Hey, I've heard stories like that with my family too."
Oh yeah, I
So
mean,
it
the
was
lights.
shocking to me.
What, and this was your great grandmother, you said?
It was like she was married to my great grandfather who was in
Okay.
the Civil War. So it was like
Oh
three
wow. Okay.
great back. Yeah.
Well, I can
It was
only
a bunch
I
of
can
great
only
ones.
assume that she was a very good person because there's a lot of stories about you know, these lights appearing directly after the death of saints. If you go back through sort of the stories of deathbed
Wow.
you know, experiences of saints, you'll find a lot of illusions of this ball of light coming into the room or leaving the room at the time of their death. Yeah.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Well, I know that my grandfather, who's my mom's dad, he was a saint. Like, I mean, he wasn't official, but in my book, he was. He was a saint. If there ever was a saint, that was my granddaddy. Okay, so it would make sense. Yeah, it
There
was
we go.
passed down.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. Okay, so one more topic because we've got just a few more minutes. We got about 10 more minutes.
Mhm.
What about the little people? Have you ever experienced the little people? I know you've studied the Fae, but what about little people? Because that's a little different. A little different.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the size thing is always a little bit confusing because, you know, the fairies were oftentimes considered size shifters. I have never experienced that. I don't think, in that sense, with one exception. There was a period of time, um, back around, I can't remember how old I must have been, maybe between 5 and 8, when my parents were putting an addition on the house that we were in, and I have since confirmed this with my mother, so I'm not misremembering this or crazy. Um, but there were parts of the house where she and I would find a stack, always 4 quarters, just stacked up. And they'll be in the oddest places, like behind, you know, a big dictionary that we hadn't pulled out in years, and we pull it out, and there would be a stack of 4 quarters back there. And you know, I don't know what that is. It kind of sounds a little bit like poltergeist phenomena, to be frank. But again, you know, a lot of the poltergeist phenomena was at one point also attributed to little people and faithful. But it also sounds very sort of impish and playful and fairy like. So that's probably the closest thing in terms of my experience with the little people that I've had. But I just find it so fascinating that, you know, you look at these old world stories of the fairies, and then you come over here and you look at all these indigenous tribes and how so many of them, I think maybe, don't quote me on this, but I think maybe something like around 80% of the tribes had stories of little people. And, you know,
Mhm.
plenty of those stories down here in Georgia as well. You know, there's the Nunyanahi was sort of a version of the Cherokee fairies. Also, the Yunwichinsi, another version of it. And I think just up the road from us in Blood Mountain, there was supposed to be a Nunyanahi townhouse at one point. And you know, Blood Mountain kind of has some interesting lore around it as well. So, yeah,
Oh,
one day, maybe, you know, maybe I'll see something.
yeah, man, there's so much going on in those mountains, and my team's up there doing Bigfoot research pretty often, and just going camping. I mean, I was just up there
Yeah.
camping about a month ago, and we have so much fun up there. Oh my gosh! So Bigfoot. Let me ask you another question. I said the little people would probably be the last thing we talk about, but we still got some time. Bigfoot. What do you think? Okay, what is a Bigfoot to you? Do you think? Okay, you said it's not just like primate in the woods. Do you think that they could be interdimensional? That's a
Well,
question that I get all the time.
so one of the things that, I mean, the short answer is yes. But
Okay.
one of the things that, I mentioned where the footprints in that I did with Tim Renner. One of the things that we did is we sort of made it a point in that book to show how so many aspects of Bigfoot lore overlap with, ghost folklore, with witch folklore, with UFO
Yes.
stories, and with fairy folklore too. I mean, it's interesting that if you look back through some of this fairy lore, again focusing on Western Europe because that's where we sort of have a lot of our data from. At one point, fairies were blamed for sneaking into stables in Devon and braiding horses' hairs, so horses' manes, which is the exact same thing that you hear in regards to Bigfoot in some parts of the U.S. today. So, I think that might be it. I kind of get even a little bit stranger than strange here at this point, and where I kind of have wound up at this point with the Bigfoot thing is that maybe it is just like the UFOs related to the dead. I can make a case for that, but also it seems to be there's another interpretation that Tim favors, that is the Bigfoot is an expression of this wild man archetype. And, I tend to think of archetypes as sort of like the source code for the universe and how our reality works. And that it continues to adapt and change over the years. And that a lot of the strange things we see in the forest or we hear in the forest, are attributable to that wild man archetype. And it just so
Mhm.
happens that the most dramatic version of that is actually seeing it. So in that sense, it might be interdimensional. I mean, there are plenty of stories I've read as well about, Bigfoot stepping in and out of portals. And that certainly explains, these trackways that in the middle of open fields that a lot of Bigfoot investigators don't like to necessarily acknowledge. But
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, yeah, I think that for me, embracing a stranger source for Bigfoot is the only thing that really reconciles a lot of these differences that I see in a lot of the data, because I do believe I've talked to enough people. I've had some Bigfoot adjacent things happen to me. I've never seen Bigfoot, but
Bigfoot adjacent.
I've talked to enough people, and there's such good physical data for there being something out there that I have to believe its existence to a degree. And yet I also have to sort of look at this other data and say, well, how do I, make these two things play together? And I think getting weird is the only way that I can do it.
Getting weird. You're
Yeah.
born weird. I tell you what,
Oh
I feel
yeah.
like I was born weird. I
Oh yeah.
was. Looking back at my life, absolutely. Now you're talking about Timothy Renner, right? With Strange Familiars.
Yes.
He's awesome. Yeah, great guy.
Yeah.
He has a great podcast, and I think I've interviewed him a while back with my buddy Bigfoot Michigan Rob. We did an interview
Yeah.
with him. Good guy.
He's a dear friend of mine, and I just found out that one of my sisters-in-law moved within a short distance of him. So now I have excuses to go see Tim regularly. So I'm happy. I'm tickled pink about that.
That's awesome. Jerry says that Duke from World Bigfoot Radio fears the fairy folk more than Bigfoot.
I tell you
Should
what,
he?
like I had this experience when I went over to Ireland in 2017 and just chatting casually with folks. There were 20 somethings I'd talk to who would say things like, well, of course I don't believe in fairies, but I'm scared to death of them. So I think that's a wise thing to be. Like they're you hear these stories about them just wreaking havoc in people's lives. Apparently they don't even like the F word, although I've been using it throughout this entire conversation. But yeah, something as simple as
Oh,
that,
really?
for something as simple as that, they could just, blind you or make you sick forever or take you or take a
What?
loved one or, oh yeah. Oh yeah. They
So
are
that's
capricious is
wild.
the word. Yeah. Capricious is the word.
Well, what do they prefer to be called? Not a
Oh,
fairy?
there are euphemisms, and they're always region dependent. The good folk,
Okay.
the fair folk, the gentry, the people of peace. Like they're always like really like flattering names, so that you're
Yeah.
not offending them. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, I learned something brand new tonight. I love that. Yeah, and it's almost like, skinwalkers. I know I'm not supposed to, some people don't like to say
Yeah.
that word. So it's very similar to that. It's like some people don't want you to say that word.
Yeah, and there, I believe it's amongst the Tlingit people of Alaska. You're not supposed to say Kushtaka, which is one of
I was,
their.
yes,
Yeah,
I was going to
yeah,
say that.
yeah, yeah,
Kushtaka,
yeah, yeah. So yes, so you do see
the
these
otter man.
prohibitions. Yeah, you do see these prohibitions against speaking the names of these things, which, it might be that people were sort of sharing these stories somehow across the Atlantic, but I'm of the opinion that everybody's coming to these conclusions because they're reaching the same objective conclusion. They're experiencing these things. That's why they have these similar beliefs, no matter where you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely fun and amazing, Joshua. Thank you so much for being here tonight. This hour has flown by, as they always
Absolutely.
do.
Totally
Yeah,
just
right?
just woof,
It
evaporated. Yeah.
did. It went by really quickly. Well, where can everybody find your books? And give my audience a little bit of information on your website.
Absolutely. You can find me at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. No S. And there are links to all my stuff there. I do have copies of some of my books that you can buy directly from me through the website. Otherwise, you can find most of them at all the online retailers. However, my last two entries, which are the Ecology of Souls, Volume 1 and 2, with a third volume that's just in notes and bibliography and appendices, those are on Amazon or for me directly. I just wrote this novel called Them Old Ways Never Died, and it was a real experiment for me, but I have plenty of those copies too. And I like to offer a discount when people bundle multiple books together. So reach out to me through my website for that. Could I plug an upcoming event?
Please, yeah, of course.
I will be attending for the fourth year in a row, I think, Strange Realities 2023 in Nashville, Tennessee. That is November 3rd through 5th, and you can find tickets for that at strangerealitiesconference.com. And it's always a good time. We always make sure that we have a lot of time built in to just hang out, after the day is through. So I would love to see some people there.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that I get to see you back in the field soon. And
Absolutely.
we've got some more exploring to do out in that meadow.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you invite me enough times, I will show up to something.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe
Promise.
you could all, we don't live too far from each other. So
Yeah,
listen, next time we go out there, I'll be sure to let you know. Okay.
sounds good to me. Thanks so
Awesome.
much. This was so much
Okay,
fun.
Joshua. It was fun. You better come back and hang out with me because this was a lot of fun tonight.
I will.
Okay.
I will.
Awesome, Joshua. Have a great night.
You
Okay. We'll
too.
see you next time.
All
Okay.
right,
I'll
take
see you in the
care.
field. All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right, y'all. That was so much fun. We got to talk about fairies tonight. Oh my gosh. Okay, so don't forget that right after this show, After Hours has a great show set up for us. They're about to go live in about 45 seconds. So y'all go over there and hang out with them. I will see you guys next time on Off the Trails. Until then, y'all come see me on my channel, The Cryptid Huntress, on YouTube. I'll be there Wednesday live with my buddy James Rink with the Secret Space Program. And we have a lot to talk about. And then I'll see y'all Thursday night at 8 p.m. I'll see y'all then. Until then, I'm the Cryptid Huntress. I'm Jessica Jones. I'm headed off the trails. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Thank you to all my moderators. You guys go hang out at After Hours. Y'all stay safe out there. Bye.